Biraz Steve'den sizlerle kendi hayatını paylaşmasını istedim. Göreceksiniz ki çok akademik bir aileden geliyor. Hatta daha önceden konuştuğumuzda bana şey demişti. Sıla, Nobel ödülü aldığımı söylemek için annemi aradığımda, annem emin misin abine vermek istemediklerini, sana aradı, yanlışlıkla sana aramış olmasınlar demişti. Çok başarılı bir aileden geliyor dediğim gibi. Kendisiyle ben Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory'de çalışırken tanışmıştım. Patronumun patronunun patronuydu. Sonra yollarımız tekrar Stanford'da kesişti ve onunla beraber bir girişim üzerine çalıştık. Şimdi de benim çalıştığım Breakthrough Energy Ventures'da Technical Advisor olarak çalışıyor. O yüzden çok onunla beraber vakit geçirebiliyorum. Biraz kendi deneyimlerinden anlatmasını, biraz climate'la ilgili, iklimle ilgili deneyimlerinden bahsetmesini istedim. Ayrıca Enerji Bakanı olması ve Enerji Bakanı olduğu sırada da kendisinin bir takım zor zamanlardan geçtiğini biliyoruz. Özellikle Deep Water Horizon olayı onun zamanında olmuştu ve onu nasıl altından kalktığını, arka planda neler geçtiğini sorduk. Onun dışında da en sonda kendisinin ne gibi şeyler yaptığını, climate üzerine, iklim değişikliği üzerine onu sorduk. Şimdi onun filmini göstereceğiz.
Hi, my name's Stephen Chu. I'm a professor at Stanford University, and it's my pleasure to talk to the YGA students in Turkey. I was asked to say a little bit about my background, so I begin by showing a picture of my mother and father and my father's oldest sister on my mother and father's wedding day. And given that they're a very handsome-looking couple, it's hard to imagine that they could produce something that looks like this. This is me when I was very young. Also, a little more background. On my mother's side, her father was a professor of civil engineering, trained at Cornell University, became a professor at Pyongyang University, but at the age of 30 became the president of that university. And his brother, Xiuan Li, was a physicist who worked with French in his PhD with Perrin, who got a Nobel Prize for Brownian motion. Again, this is my parents. More pictures of me. And so I also should mention that I was growing up in this family. My mother, father, both sides of the family were very distinguished scholars. But my older brother, Gilbert, he went to Princeton as an undergraduate, got a PhD in physics, and then got an MD PhD in medicine at Harvard and MIT. And now he's a professor of oncology and professor of biochemistry at Stanford. And my younger brother has 5 degrees, including PhD at the age of 22 from UCLA, law degrees from Yale and Harvard. He's arguably the most famous patent litigator in the entire United States, and he was president of the Board of Overseers of Harvard in 2014. So you can imagine growing up with this family, what a failure I was. And notice I was the only person not to get degrees from Harvard. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I was also a member of Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And Lawrence Berkeley Labs, many scientists who worked there got Nobel Prizes. This is, again, slightly out of date. There's 16 scientists. Another one, Carolyn Bottozzi, got this year's Nobel Prize in chemistry, and so now they're up to 17. But more important, maybe 3 dozen young scientists who worked as graduates and postdocs at the beginning of their career at Lawrence Berkeley Lab went on to get Nobel Prizes. So I said, well, if I'm really interested in climate change, could I start to talk about and develop some enthusiasm, and maybe some of these world-class scientists could be interested in thinking if they could do something to help mitigate the biggest risks in climate change by doing new science and things like that. Among those things, I thought that it was possible to use recent advances in biology to see if you can make sustainable biofuels, either from plants or algae, things like that, and then recruited a person from Stanford, Chris Somerville, who's one of the star scientists at Woods Hole, to join with a person at Berkeley and Berkeley Lab, Jay Kiesling, to see if we could do something about that. And that was long before there was any call for proposals. It was a year or two before that. And little did we know that BP was thinking of investing in biofuels. They didn't ask us to join, but after they heard what we were thinking of doing, they said, okay, you guys can also bid on it. And much to the surprise of MIT, Illinois, and other people, we got the proposal, and this is the announcement of the proposal. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger announcing we got a $500 million grant from BP. So there were a number of things started at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. This is one of them, lots more on solar stuff. Very exciting time. But then I was thinking maybe after 5 or 6 years, I'd step down. I was a professor in physics at Berkeley. Stanford actually let me keep my appointment at Stanford, which was kind of unprecedented because of the rivalry. And I was going to continue going back just as an ordinary professor, but then something else intervened. And what happened was in the third week in November, I get this call from some person that says that the president-elect, this is President Obama, would like to talk to me about a possibility of a job. And I said on the phone, well, I wasn't really thinking of working for the government, but how important a job is this? And they said, well, Secretary of Energy. So I flew to Chicago and talked with him, just the two of us one-on-one for an hour. He wanted to know what I thought about this, that, and the other thing. I wanted to see what he was like, because I wasn't really looking for another administrative job. I wanted to go back to science. And but I was very impressed with him during that hour. And afterward, I called my wife and said, look, this guy's very impressive. If he asks me, I will say yes. He did ask me 2 weeks later, when that was in January 20 and 21. I was sworn in the 21st. It was approved before, earlier in January. In those days, it's not as divisive as it was today. And so actually, the Senate has to confirm you. And I actually got 100% confirmation votes. Again, the politics are different today, but we started RPE. We had discretionary money, $38 billion to spend on helping the economy come back. Out of that grew RPE and a few other initiatives. And so that's a pretty healthy discretionary budget for 2 years. The entire Department of Energy budget is about $68 billion a year. Very, very exciting stuff. I went there again, like at Berkeley, with the intent of working on developing new technologies and getting them deployed to combat climate change. And talk about where we are today. And where we are today on our present trajectory in 2022 is that if you look at these future scenarios of no policy, current policies, pledges, targets, and then next to them are the predicted temperature ranges based on the best climate models we have today. And right now, with current policies, we're on a trajectory that will put us around 3 degrees centigrade higher than before the Industrial Revolution. We're already about 1.1, 1.2 degrees higher. The pathways of 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade means that emissions of carbon dioxide and all the greenhouse gases around the world in every sector actually have to go negative by either 2070 or year 2000. And that's very, very hard to get it to be negative, considering where all the emissions come from. I personally think we're not going to stay below 450 parts per million or even 550 parts per million. I think we'll go to about 600. Things about Obama's choice for Secretary of Energy was I was the first scientist cabinet member in the history of the United States, not in the DOE, but in any cabinet. But not only was I a scientist, I was a practicing scientist. So that means I wasn't retired and become a bureaucrat. I was actually still ran a research group. And so for that reason, the president actually treated me like a scientist. And when this is a picture of the Macondo oil spill after the drilling rig caught fire, and it exploded in April and then drifted off for a few days, finally sunk, and then underneath 1 mile deep, the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, oil and gas started spewing out of this oil well. And so the president said he had heard I made a suggestion to the BP engineers about how one could detect what the so-called blowout prevention platform was doing using cobalt-60 gamma ray source to take essentially like gamma ray x-rays of the valves, state of the valves. The BP engineers laughed at it, but then they thought about it one more day and they said, maybe he's right. So for whatever reason, I didn't tell the president, but someone else did. And so after a cabinet meeting in early May, May 1 or 2, he comes up to me and says, Chu, go down there and help them stop the leak. So what I decided to do was assemble, call up a few really smart out-of-the-box thinkers and just go down there and see what we could do. Afterward, my wife at the end of 2012 said, I know you want to stay here another 4 years, but she said, no one's irreplaceable, not even you, and I'm going back to California. And I hope you join me. So I had to tell President Obama, I'm really sorry, but I think she's been pretty patient, and we've been living here for 4 years and got to go back. So he said, fine. We talked a little bit about what I thought he should do in the next 4 years. What happened? I had no space, no funding, no nothing, no graduate students. All I could do was think, which was good. That turned out to be liberating. And so I began thinking of lots of ideas and finally got space after a year and started, through seed funding and Moore Foundation and stuff like that. Again, new areas, started working on batteries with Each Way, new ideas on batteries, started working on some of the things I wanted to do in molecular biology. We're developing new methods of extracting lithium from salty water that we hope will be non-polluting. I have a very small group of only 5 or 6 people. Each person works on a different thing, but we're also able to develop the method of getting very large pieces of DNA into cells. Why is that important? Because it's important because in a field called synthetic biology, where you can modify organisms like microbes, people have modified microbes so that they form symbiotic relationships with the roots of plants like corn. And so these microbes actually fix nitrogen that occurs naturally in the soil from the air into plant food, nitrogen-based plant food, so you need less fertilizer. The biggest greenhouse gas emissions from growing grains is the fertilizer runoff, nitrous oxide, N2O. It's bigger greenhouse gas emission than the making of the fertilizer, which is about 2% of greenhouse gas emission in the world, because you need a lot of energy to convert to make nitrogen-based things in what's called the Haber-Bosch process, to make ammonia, then urea, then fertilizer. So the future of biology, in my opinion, would be to generate a set of microbes for each major grain, including wheat and rice, or all these grains, so you could replace 80–90% of the fertilizer, not only nitrogen-based, but also phosphorus, potash, and other things. Progress is slow because it takes a half dozen years to make these microbes, because you can only vary one gene at a time. And so we, in my lab, developed a method where you can put in a dozen genes at a time. Because of the things I've learned in the Department of Energy, because of the things I've learned being on the board of directors of companies, I've also helped use that to help guide what I do in research. And so the saga continues, but today I'm just an ordinary professor at Stanford. And aside from that, that's my brief but not so spectacular take on what I've been doing.